Hi, I'm Rachel, and this is my reading wrap-up for November 2022. I didn't do any Friday reads or am reading videos last month because I was doing NaNoWriMo, so I just incorporated all the books I'll be talking about here into my weekly vlogs. But I figured just to be useful to some people who are more interested in the books than my writing journey, I would just consolidate some quick recaps of the 8 books that I read for November. Here I am filming in the morning. I was hoping it might be a more cloudy day and the sun wouldn't be coming in like this, but what can you do? Anyway, I will link down below to my November literary newsletter where I have snippets from the Goodreads reviews for all of these books and also bookish news that caught my fancy, a book pick, a book quote, etc. But also, the first book I'll talk about I actually did not include in my November literary newsletter because technically I finished it in November, but I started it in October, so I put it in the October newsletter. And that book is Rebel Daughter by Banov Kaufmann. This is a book that takes place during the fall of Jerusalem in 70 CE. In the years leading up to that, this was a time period where the Romans were occupying what was then Judea and Jerusalem and those surrounding areas, which at the time was a Jewish kingdom. And it was a very tumultuous time, and we are following this young protagonist named Esther, who, in fact, the author found an inscription of a Jewish slave from around this time in Italy, and realized that, if a Jewish slave had, when I say inscription, I mean like a gravestone inscription, and if she had this much care about her put into place, obviously she had somebody significant who cared about her, and so she decided to make up a story for this young person who she imagines as the daughter of a priest in this time period when Rabbinic Judaism is sort of like starting to come together, and Temple Judaism, well, at the end of the fall of Jerusalem, really is no more. But anyway, we follow her throughout these years. She takes us through what Jerusalem is like at this time, where there's a lot of unrest and Jewish groups, radical Jewish groups, really trying to stand up to, the oppression and just sort of the overreach, as it were, of colonizers, and how things go from there. It's a very detailed book. There's a whole lot of world-building research in it that I kind of came to it for that purpose because I'm writing a fantasy novel that's based in part off of this time, and I found it pretty easy to take notes. Like sometimes I think she went too much into, just info dumping that way, but it is a really fascinating story, and we see the different factions of people in Jerusalem during this time and what led to the ultimate downfall of the city, and how Esther and her brother were taken to Rome, but they had a relationship previously with a Roman citizen who was once a slave himself, and so he becomes the character who ultimately takes her out of slavery. So it's, I think, a compelling story. I think, and it's YA, so it's approachable in terms of for that audience. So I think people would get a lot out of it. My first official book of November was Before All the World by Moriel, Rothman, Zecher, which I listened to on audio, so here is a picture. This also has to do with Jewish history, but from a very different time. This is about the turn of the 20th century and about a couple of Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe, from the Russian Empire to the United States. The last book was approachable as sort of a YA, as a YA almost coming of age, I suppose. And this one is much more literary, much more experimental, probably would not get as much love because of that. Rothman Zecher is trying to play with Yiddish language a lot. There's a whole lot of Yiddish in this, and he goes into different dialects and into sort of creating his own brand of Yinglish, English and Yiddish. And in fact, some people on Goodreads have been confused by this book. They thought it was a translation because a fictional character in the book is technically translating in the book. So it's something that you have to be really invested in, I think, to get something out of this story. But broadly speaking, it's about these two survivors of a pogrom in the Russian Empire who come to America, and they meet up with this gay black man, and they get involved in socialist and communist circles, and it's just sort of this look at I guess, hybrid communities and about trauma. You know, one of the major parts that I remember from this highly experimental book is a very long segment in which one of the characters actually buries all of the dead of her community, because she and this other young boy were the only survivors of the pogrom. And so she buries all of the dead of her community and, like, basically gives everybody that she can, like, a really brief eulogy, just, you know, moving in that sort of overwhelming sort of way. But it's not, I don't think the type of storytelling that traditionally people would, you know, easily gravitate toward, but if you're into experimentalism, it might be for you. The next book I read is The Unbroken by C.L. Clarke. This is a secondary world fantasy novel, which takes place in a world that is, I think, loosely inspired by Algeria and French colonization, you know, a century or so ago. And we are following a couple of main characters in this beginning of a series. This is Terrain on the cover. She was a conscript who was taken from a colonized land and trained in Balladeer, I think it is, to be a soldier to fight for the Empire. And the book opens when she and her fellow conscripts are actually sent back to the city where she was born to sort of, well, they're kind of trying to quell some unrest, and they're there to support the Princess Luca, who in fact is supposed to become Empress of Balladeer. But her uncle is, you know, keeping the seat, ostensibly because she isn't metal tested yet, you know. It's not, certainly not about the fact that he just wants power, you know. But anyway, that's the second character we're following is Luca, and so Terrain comes to her homeland for the first time. She's been highly indoctrinated by the Balladeer system, even though she and her fellow conscripts, they are derisively called Sands, and really not treated all that well. But, you know, this is the culture she grew up in. She doesn't even remember the language of her homeland anymore, so she's very much in an in-between state. And of course, things come to pass that she you know, starts to question her own motivations and so forth. And she works with Luca for a little while, trying to find like a diplomatic way to get around, you know, the colonial versus oppressed schisms, as you do. But there's a lot of complicating factors in this book, I think. I mean, obviously, Clarke shows violent colonialism for what it is, but I think she sees human beings as, you know, complicated, and has sympathy for people. I think especially like someone like Terrain, who is so much, you know, in between cultures, and like we can understand why she might have the sympathy she does for Balladeer and for Luca. And Luca herself is someone who, even though she is I guess blinded perhaps by the colonial system that she's a part of, she also has redeeming attributes. She also is disabled, which, you know, is technically neither here nor there, but it gives her an interesting, like, outsider perspective in a different aspect, and, you know, adds to her character. So I thought it was a really strong opening where it really was able to talk about these sorts of you know, real-life inspired world-building events with a lot of care and interesting factors. And I am looking forward. I think the next book is coming out next year, so I'm looking forward to continuing the series. Next, I turn to contemporary mainstream fiction with Shelter Us by Nicole Diamond. This is one of my top of the Goodreads TBR books that I put on the list a couple years ago, and now it got to the top of the list, and finally I read it, and I liked this book. This was a book about with nominal Jewish themes, about a mother who lost her infant daughter, you know, in one of those sort of crib accident sort of things where the girl dies in her sleep. And it's, you know, traumatizing for her, and she, you know, it's a year or so later, and she has 2 other children, and she's just trying to get on with her life, but, you know, there's this trauma that she has to deal with too, and she happens to latch on to a couple of homeless people she comes across just in daily travels, and she decides that she really needs to help them, specifically the two of them. She doesn't, like, you know, join like a shelter or anything like that as a volunteer, but she really falls for this young mother and her child. You know, perhaps, you know, some projection going on there. The young mother, teenage mother, is named Josie, and her son Tyler. So our main character Sarah starts secretly spending time with these people, kind of like keeping it a secret from her husband, who is kind of shocked by how much like she wants to open their homes to these strangers. So we have this storyline going on, and ultimately Sarah, you know, gets really embroiled in Josie's situation, and it leads her to sort of going off track herself in terms of you know, how she's lying to her husband and getting involved in other spoilery things, I guess, that she shouldn't be, like with an old flame and that sort of thing, so I guess I'm big spoilery. But anyway, it's about grief. It's also about, you know, about family and about, like, what happens, I think, when, you know, you aren't truthful with your family. It's one of the books maybe some people would be very annoyed by, because a lot of the problems Sarah and especially her husband are having are about them not communicating well with each other. Although, to be fair, that seems to be, you know, grief tends to mess that up a little bit. I guess I had a few quibbles about this novel and how some things sort of like conveniently happened. And I guess one of my quibbles too is I feel like, you know, at the end of the story, it's about trying to get the relationship back on track, but I feel like the characters didn't really do the work for that. You know, it felt like Sarah got off too easy, I think, in my head. It just felt, I don't know, kind of lame in a way. I don't know, maybe I'm thinking too much about the Repentance book I read over the high holidays, and she should do more work, and her husband should too. But I think it is a really interesting look at grief in a very specific sort of circumstance, the way that fiction can, you know, bring a particular character's insularity to life, and so I will always like it for things like that. But now we're getting to my favorite read of the month, another one of the top of the Goodreads TBR picks. This is Orphan number 8 by Kim van Alkemade. This is historical fiction, which is, again, much more Jewish in tone. Again, we are near the beginning of the 20th century in one timeline, and the second timeline is all in 1954. We are following a young girl who is orphaned, more or less, and sent to basically a Hebrew orphan society in 1919. She's 4 years old, so she's kept with the infants. And it turns out that this infant home has some modern, you know, top of the arts at the time, like X-ray facilities. And so doctors and interns are coming there to do research on X-rays and radiation. And what do you know? You have these orphans as subjects, and, you know, they don't have, you know, parents who can stand up for them. So our orphan Rachel becomes orphan number 8 in this study on radiation and X-rays, which, you know, to be fair, at the time, they didn't realize that, you know, that's more harmful than it is helpful. And, you know, in 1954, Rachel is of an age where, you know, she might be experiencing the after effects. It seems quite likely, I would think, that her breast cancer is associated with the radioactive treatment she was forced into. So in 1954, she is working as a nurse in the Hebrew home for the elderly, basically, and this doctor who experimented on her is in her 60s and now dying herself of bone cancer, again, probably because of her own radiation exposure. And Rachel, through this experience and through doing some research now that she has the medical knowledge, realizes she had grown up thinking that, you know, Dr. Mildred, you know, did these things to her to help cure her of something, and she didn't realize she was a healthy young child who was used as an experiment until all of she started digging and her memory started coming back. So it becomes something where she has to decide what to do with this, as she also is trying to get her, you know, her own, realizing she has cancer herself. And so what's she going to do now that she has this invalid woman who treated her horribly under her thumb? And I mean, that makes it sound like it is a you know, a thriller suspense novel, and I think some people were disappointed that really it isn't. It's not about thriller and suspense. I think it's much more literary. It's much more about people's, you know, emotional character arcs. And the first storyline from Rachel's formative years. I mean, we start with her in the infant home, and then it goes and follows her like until she's in her teens, and just about what her life turned out to be like after this experimentation, and like with her brother in the next orphanage, and all sorts of stuff like that. And there's a lot of Jewish history in it, because these are all Jewish institutions, because they were founded at a time when basically nobody else would be looking after the Jews except for themselves. So there's just a lot of Jewish history in here as well, which I loved. And so I really found it very compelling. I feel like I'm having a soft spot in my heart lately for like mainstream fiction with strong characters and a strong story. I guess maybe I'm getting less snobby and literary or something, because I mean, I feel like this is something that isn't quite highfalutin enough to be literary, but it is, you know, it's a deeply thoughtful mainstream fiction, a probably very book club accessible book. I'm surprised, actually, after I talked about it on Facebook, how many people I know have read this book. So I think it's a great endorsement. I think it's a good read. My next book I read is the recent Goodreads Choice Award winner in fiction, Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow by Gabrielle Zevin. I'm kind of excited. I got to read this before voting. You know, it's the only time I'm kind of in with the in crowd, really. Very few books I've read that are on Goodreads Choice Awards. But anyway, I also wanted to read this book in general because I've read the author before and I liked her work, and she's writing about gaming culture and geekery, and I really wanted to read a book about, you know, people, you know, living their lives through gaming culture, because, you know, we have things like Ready Player One, which is sort of gatekeeping and just about sort of being smug in a bunch of old references. Or we have something like one of my favorite authors wrote. She wrote The Chalk Artist by Allegra Goodman, which was really lazily dismissive of gaming culture, and I'm still very disappointed in one of my favorite authors for doing that. But here we have something where gaming culture, you know, we can see it for all it is. I mean, we do look into the misogyny in gaming culture, but it isn't just something that's, you know, just silly or stupid. In fact, it brings a lot of meaning to our main characters, who are Sam and Sadie, who are these two kids who meet in the 80s when they're young children, and then they reconnect in college and create a game together, which really propels them into being game makers with a company in their own right. And so this becomes a part of their careers and a part of their personal lives. I mean, they have other stuff going on as well. And really, gaming is it's not just some weird, you know, existential thing. It's just, you know, part of how, you know, people might see the world. You know, the way that we might look toward literature or other parts of pop culture to bring meaning. And of course it also, you know, is a part of their day-to-day lives. I just thought it was really beautiful the way this came together, and really is a really uplifting novel. You know, we talk so much about literary fiction that's, you know, so down in the dumps, but I feel like even though, you know, there's sad things that happen in this, it's about how, you know, the things that these characters go through bring them together and, you know, bring them meaning throughout all the years of this, you know, novel that spans a few decades. So I understand the appeal. I think this was a really strong novel, something that's like a nice palate cleanser in a way. I mean, even though there are some definite sad, spoilery parts to it, but I understand the appeal, and I think people would like this one. And then next I read The Vanished Birds by Simon Jimenez. This is science fiction that takes place in the far future. Well, actually, I guess it starts about 1,000 years in the future from us, and then jumps 1,000 more. So 1,000 years in the future from us, you know, humans are getting together, you know, the best of the best in terms of scientific know-how are getting together to create space stations to leave, and we're turning into, you know, I guess not turning into, but, you know, leaning into our corporate affiliations about who gets to run the world or the galaxy or what have you. So we start with the character Fumiko. Technically we don't start with her at the beginning of this novel, but she's the character who technically jumps everything off in this, where she is tasked to create a space station, and she names them after the vanishing birds of Earth that she's seeing in conservation societies. There's just so few left. So people who can leave Earth do leave Earth, and then for 1,000 years we have this corporations who basically run things. And the one corporation we follow, you know, they start colonizing planets and I guess bringing people into the planets, and some of the planets are like city-states, but some of them are basically, I guess in a way, it's not called colonization, but you know, they're basically using these people for their resources. So actually the book opens up on this planet that's owned by the corporation, and the people there live a very agrarian lifestyle and make foodstuffs and what have you, and every 15 years for them, members of the corporate empire come to pick up the supplies. But these people travel through pocket wormholes space, so basically what takes them a couple, like 8 months back and forth, everybody else experiences through 15 years. So Jimenez starts the story by talking about this young man who lives on a planet and lives his entire life and has a relationship with this captain of a spaceship who he sees once every 15 years, and throughout all of his life she only ages like 5 years. I mean, it's just, I love these world building conceits of science fiction, how big and maximist you can go. And then, you know, later there's a young boy who crash lands, and he has like a big destiny in terms of time travel, and he you know, gets involved with the people of the spaceship from the beginning, like Nia, the captain, and so forth. And it's very much in a way like sort of vignettes in a way, or well, very long vignettes, but kind of stories that jump around because, you know, the time frame is 1,000 years. And Fumiko is still alive, actually, thanks to, you know, the power of living most of her life in cryosleep. And I guess as fascinated as I was by all of these world-building questions and imagination, I kind of wish the characters had more heart to them. And I guess I felt like I was missing out on that. So I went back and forth because I was so in love with the imagination and with all of these huge questions about society and life and meaning and time that came up in this book. But I really wished, especially Fumiko, I thought she had so much promise that, you know, that I don't know if you can really get that close to a character and keep, you know, the millennia, you know, time span, you know, talking about the huge big pictures like that in one book, unless it's, you know, humongous maybe. I don't know. I think that's, I guess, a major problem with science fiction books like this, but I can't say I didn't enjoy it, but I do quibble about it too. And maybe that brings us to this book, my craft book of November. I've been trying to read craft books. Maybe it's not the best things to do while actually trying to write 50,000 words, is read a craft book about what you're doing wrong or something like that. But this one is called The Emotional Craft of Fiction, How to Write the Story Beneath the Surface by Donald Maas. This is the only book I might be able to say counts for nonfiction November, although I feel like craft books are kind of something else. Like it's almost like, you know, how-to, self-help sort of stuff. But anyway, I say I thought about the last book because this one is where Donald Maas, who is a literary agent, posits that most contemporary fiction doesn't have emotional stakes that are high enough. And like genre fiction, for example, like leans too far into genre conventions, and literary fiction is too wordy and dry, and nobody cares enough about the characters and their stakes and the journeys that the reader should go on for the characters and their stakes. And so I'm like, that really is kind of what bothered me a little bit about the last novel, and also about the novel that I'm trying to write, the fantasy novel, where I'm also getting hugely embroiled in the world building questions and wondering if my characters are coming off okay, because they need to have emotional stakes. And I really like this book a lot. You know, there's so many how-to books that I feel like can be a bit disconnected. Like one thing he goes after here is like, you know, the character cheat sheet sort of things where, you know, you ask all sorts of nonsensical questions about where your character went to college or something, which may or may not have anything to do with the book at hand. And he focuses in deep with all of these examples from literature and then the work pages he does at the end about asking these emotional questions, like meeting these characters where they are, about the events that really shaped them as humans. Like, don't like force something onto them just because it's easy to think up a university name or something like that. But to really think about you know, the events and the feelings that shaped them and should, you know, then shape their arcs in the story. And he just has so many examples in here about how to write emotion for like different types of plots and plotless stories and for different, you know, character beats that you're trying to get to. You know, it's a bit overwhelming to sort of just read straight through. I feel like I should take the time to try to do some of the exercises, which are very much steeped in go to your own manuscript and think of these things. So again, it's not about like trying to force something else on what you're writing. It really is, I think, trying to meet the writer where they are in the story where it should be. If you agree with him and think that emotional stakes should be a major part of any story. My one major quibble, I think, would be he leans a little far into the moralizing fiction, like how all characters should be good, or, you know, I don't know, I feel like that gets too dogmatic. I tend to go more toward multifaceted characters, that I want characters to like feel like, you know, they're not just one-dimensional, because really humans aren't one-dimensional, and nobody really believes, or very few people I would think really believe they're the bad guys. Everybody justifies things, and everybody has different dimensions to their lives, and that's how even characters who might be bad guys, you know, can have interesting parts to them. But overall, I feel like this is a great book. I would recommend it to anyone who's a writer. Maybe you should move with it slower than I did. And the final book I read, I kind of decided on a whim to read it, even though I should have decided long ago to read it, or reread it, I should say, because this is The Amber Spyglass by Philip Pullman, which I read over a decade ago. I sort of did this mad dash dive into the His Dark Materials trilogy about 10 years ago before the movie came out, and now I decided to reread The Amber Spyglass right before the BBC HBO season 3 of His Dark Materials, which chronicles this book, came out. It just started airing last weekend. I am obsessed. I love it. And now now I remember a bunch of the stuff that I forgot from a decade ago. So anyway, I'm talking about book 3 of a series, so it feels very spoilery, but this is a middle grade sort of portal fantasy where there's multiple worlds that people can travel between. It's kind of a retelling of Paradise Lost in a way, except that instead of, I guess, God being the good guy, God is the bad guy. Or the authority, who technically isn't God. It's like somebody, an angel pretending to be God. So, you know, I feel like people think of Philip Pullman as atheist, or his story at least. I should not, Philip Pullman, you know, that's different. His own beliefs are different. But I mean, the book series is an atheist. It's more about, you know, choosing free thinking over dogmatism, no matter who exists. And that's what the main character, the man who is sort of trying to, you know, wage war against heaven, which is what's happening in this book, is Lord Asriel. But the real character we're following is his daughter, Lyra, who has been tasked with being the new Eve, which, especially in Christian terms, Eve is known for being the person who brought sin into the world. So, you know, the authoritarian religious organizations want to kill her, or else, you know, heaven forbid, we all be brought into darkness again. And of course, the free-thinking alternative is that maybe she is allowing freedom of thought and of expression, and how growing up isn't sinful, it's just a part of life, and shouldn't be shamed or condemned. And within this, it's also a growing up tale then for Lyra, our main character, who grows from being a preteen into burgeoning adulthood. And I remember how I really felt like 10 years ago, I thought, like, he really nailed what it's like to be a 12-year-old girl. I feel like I was less absolutely obsessed and loved with this book this time around, maybe because it was a first-time thing. But I still really like the story and what it's trying to do in large part. I feel like my own fantasy novel is in large part in conversation with this book, in some aspects anyway. Multifaceted again, like my own fantasy work is trying to do a lot of things. This is also trying to do a lot of things. So I really enjoyed it. And I'm pumped now to be able to watch the rest of His Dark Materials Season 3 with knowing what may be changed and what might not be from this book. And that about covers it for me now. I've rambled on longer than I kind of hoped to, and my battery is going, and I gotta get moving myself. but expect me back on this channel imminently. I'm hoping to, you know, stay on target with my Friday Reads videos. I was so good in November with making my vlogs in a timely fashion that maybe I can carry it forward and not be so concerned, like if I haven't read enough on Friday, then who cares? I don't know. Anyway, basically I am indeed starting to read more into December, and I have, you know, stuff to talk about, so stay tuned. Unless I do have some early cold symptoms. Hopefully they won't get too bad. Hopefully I can quell this nip it in the bud, but we'll see. But expect me back here. And in the meantime, thanks so much for watching, everyone. And I'll see you next time.